Good morning.
Hello.
And
How's it
we're
going?
back. Yeah, good. Right, we are back, everybody, with another episode on propaganda. So we finally got through in 3 episodes the Age of Propaganda book, and now we're going to do Propaganda by Edward Bernays, the original script, the Bible of propaganda.
I wonder whether we should have started like the whole propaganda thing with this one and then build on it. But to be fair, it's fine. We're closing the loop now with this one.
Yes.
So yes, like you said, by Edward Bernays, which I find really interesting is that he's the nephew of Freud. That's quite interesting.
Well, I was going to say there are links, I guess, between some of his ideas, so to speak. Like he talks about, I wasn't going to say he talks about like repressed feelings. In fact, he kind of does, doesn't he? He talks about like identifying with like idols, etc.
I think the interest of psychology of the mass, whereas like Freud is the individual, he's like the mass, the organization.
You can tell there's some level of like, my uncle's like studying this stuff, I'm really interested in it. Maybe can I apply it to the mass perspective rather than just the individual?
No, precisely. So this book I think was written in like 1920s, I want to say, or
something like that. I want to say it was post World War One.
Yes, I don't. I think it was prior to World War Two.
Propaganda. I'm sure it's. Right. 1928. There you go. So
1928.
The World Wars.
Yes. And so a lot of what he like talks about in this, he kind of approaches propaganda as just like a kind of tool in itself that isn't good or isn't bad. It is merely just a means of communicating something from the individual to the mass. So the purpose of this book that he explains is to explain the structure of the mechanism which controls the public mind and to tell how it manipulates by the special leader who seeks to create public acceptance for a particular idea or commodity. What did you think of the book overall?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure I read this after Age of Propaganda. I think I did, at least. I think that's literally how we've structured it.
Yeah, I think you did.
I thought it was really interesting just to see, I guess, the guy who pretty much created the PR industry, his take on how, I guess it does talk as well about how government should be run, or like how society should be run. And there's a lot of like underpinning philosophy around his views on this, which is that there should be like an elite who tells people what to do. Essentially, that's kind of one of the big core points I got from this. And it's just interesting to read this when it was already produced in 1928, and just to see how this has come about now with some of the stuff we've seen recently with COVID, etc. And also then to see I guess the rationalizations of the people who are doing this stuff. So like he tries to rationalize why it's good to like control what people believe and stuff. And I think it's quite interesting to see, because I would assume the people who do this now probably believe in the philosophies he's saying of like, it's good to control, people's perspectives on things, because essentially the way I see it as well is he doesn't believe that people should be allowed to decide themselves almost. You kind of get what I mean? He almost feels like there is a right or wrong, and that should be dispelled to, the masses or to the general population, and they shouldn't be able to like figure out for themselves. But I mean, it was a short, quite easy read, to be honest. Actually, was it easy? I don't know about you, but there were some parts of it I thought maybe because the language has evolved since 1928 that it was a bit hard to get your head around. And also just like some of the things that he would talk about don't really exist anymore, and so you're kind of like trying to understand it in that kind of context, and you're like, oh, okay, I've got to kind of apply it to today's. I was going to say some of the examples he uses, right? We don't have them in our heads as examples, because he's using like the examples of propaganda from that day and age. So for example, I think he does talk about the World War propaganda, of which we weren't really subjected to. We kind of learned it through history, history lessons, but we weren't there to sort of experience it. I did find it quite interesting as well, because did the edition you have the sort of commentary at the beginning, like
yes, yeah.
Because he kind of made it out that the context of the book as well was obviously promoting his philosophy of propaganda, because since World War One, propaganda had become to sort of mean like it had a nefarious purpose to it, like we discussed last time. Propaganda even now is seen to be like nefarious, like it's, you know, manipulation, mind control, and his kind of a goal, I guess, with the book was to reestablish like a more positive view of propaganda to the mass. But also the guy who commented at the beginning was saying, from a historical context, it was also Edward Bernays' attempt to like establish credibility and like basically sell himself to governments as like a service. Did you pick that up as well?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
At the beginning, he was talking about how like he wrote this book as well to like convince others that they needed him to help them with their PR. So it was almost like a sales manual, which is kind of what you see these days when people, I don't know, are like a thought leader in their space. They usually write books, and the book obviously, you know, tries to make money by selling it, but at the same time it sells their services because they're like, oh, look at me, I'm an expert on this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Which I thought was quite interesting as well.
Yeah. No, I found the book quite interesting because I think it took quite a different perspective. I'd never come across propaganda where it's kind of defended. You know, it's because, and we'll talk about this throughout the podcast, but like you said, it's got a nefarious association to it. Like it did have a negative connotation because it's very like it was heavily used in the war, and so people have this association with the enemy and all of that kind of stuff, and so they just saw it as like a tool of manipulation rather than a tool for disseminating information from
a tool that can be used for good or bad, I guess you could say. Right? Like
and that's kind of his point in this is that like. And I don't know whether he's using that to kind of justify and kind of justify his ideas. Because like you just said, if it's like a sales manual, right, he wants to come off in a good light. So he's probably going to say these things that, oh yeah, but you know, it's got to be truthful and accurate and, you know, otherwise it's malicious, right? But then, you know, you can say that for what's that word that I always plausible deniability, right? So that he can be like, oh no, but you know, this was my main aim, right? So I don't know whether it's coming from that kind of direction or whether he actually believes that it should be, you know, the truth that is disseminated. It's just like you said, it does have. It's very elitism or intellectualism, whereby these intellectual elites should control the masses because there's just so many decisions to be made, especially with a growing population and a growing society, that it all needs to be organized. And this is the means or the tool that has to be used. That was his kind of approach, you know? So yeah, I thought it was quite interesting just as like a kind of academic view, as like a neutral view towards propaganda.
No, 100%. I think it's quite interesting. I don't know whether you got it in your notes, but there was a point, and I can't remember whether it was at the beginning where the person who was commenting on Edward Bernays, obviously the book, mentioned that Edward Bernays, for example, he was the one who started off with the Marlboro Man, I believe, to sell Marlboro cigarettes, the cowboy. But he basically said that Edward Bernays also, once he realized, or once the health literature came out and said smoking was bad, he actively created campaigns against the industry. So, which kind of shows a level of like integrity within him. So, although he's like known for like manipulation, it was literally said that he realized, obviously, you know, there actually is bad effects from what he's promoted, and then he went the opposite way and then actively promoted against it. Which, and also, to be fair, you have to be fair to him. Back then, it wasn't well known that smoking was bad.
No, of course not.
I mean, obviously now it seems so obvious. Oh, obviously putting like, you know, smoke into your lungs isn't a good idea. But back then, because everybody was doing it, there was nobody really investigating the effects, like long-term effects, that is. Who is he to be like, oh no, I need to like validate this before I promote it? You know, but the fact is he changed his mind when the situation changed, which I thought was, you know, obviously it shows a level of character for him to do that, right? Like, and like he didn't just write it in his book that he believes is a tool for good and bad, and then, you know, he then went off and used it for bad. He actually did. Went against, So I thought that was quite interesting to see that side of him, because I feel like when you hear of propaganda, Edward Bernays, you genuinely think of like a puppeteer, and that's the association I have, at least before this book.
No, that is a very good point to mention. Actually, yeah, it does reflect his character, and it's interesting because we like as humans, I think, to believe in free will and that people aren't controlling our behavior, and so any talk about it, even if it's for the betterment, is still kind of like triggering, to know that some people are controlling your behavior. And so I think propaganda will always kind of have a negative connotation, even if it is useful and effective. And I think there is a quote that I got at some point, and it was like, what is it? I'll get it quickly. It was...
Is it that we are governed?
Yeah. No, it was like, just because profit can be made from widespread understanding of something does not condemn the dissemination of such information. And it is interesting. Like, it is a tool at the end of the day, like we said. It can be used for good and bad. And realistically, any implementation of it will benefit some people and disadvantage others. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong, And so I thought it's hard to get around, because I think it's being used a lot of the time for bad, and it hasn't been to disseminate truth. And that's why because we already have this anchor of this like negative connotation with it, we just assimilate all of the bad things that propaganda does rather than any of the good stuff it does.
I'm trying to find the quote I had as well, because he talks about this idea that, it's a completely normal human activity in a sense, because every time you meet somebody or interact with somebody, you are in a way being a propagandist, in the sense that you're trying to convey something to them. So I'm just trying to see if I can find it. I don't know if I have it. What is the spoken now? But yeah, it was basically saying like there's no way to kind of. It just really depends how you define propaganda, right? Like it depends how loose you really want to make it. If you want to define propaganda as basically convincing somebody of an idea, then we are all propagandists in a way. Whenever we, choose to tell people certain things and not others, because that is, but by definition, like you're trying to propagate an idea and removing the negative. Like let's just say I'm trying to convince you that I'm a nice guy.
You're wearing a blue shirt.
Yeah, exactly. I will tell you everything that is for me being a nice guy, and avoid anything that's the bad, which is essentially is propaganda in a way, because you are selectively choosing the evidence to portray a particular idea to somebody. By that definition, this is kind of why he kind of defends this idea of propaganda, because he's trying to say that, be good or bad, we're all doing it anyway. So why don't we at least get out in the open what it is, and then at least try and figure out what the common good is, I guess. Like, it's kind of like, this is the mechanism, this is how it works. Why don't we now have a debate on how to like use it the most
hone those? Yeah, absolutely.
Because within propaganda itself, it doesn't tell you what's right or wrong. It's down to the people who take the messages, etc., and then find out the larger context whether something is right or wrong, right? Which there's no right answers on this sort of stuff, is there? Really?
No, there isn't. No. So should we jump into it?
Go for it. Where do you want to start? So we've got overall of like Edward Bernays, the history, etc. Should we just go by chapters, or?
I think so. Why not? It gives it a bit of structure anyway. So I guess, like we were talking before about how the word was perceived, I think we should probably start with like before World War One. So its meaning was less derogatory, because I think, like I mentioned earlier on, it was applied during the war and it had that association to the enemy. So before the war, and we're talking World War One here, its definition at the time was kind of any association, systematic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation of a particular doctrine or practice. And it was kind of weird because it was used a lot during the war, and he says in his book here that it was kind of the status or the value of the word was like improved. Like the war improved status of like advertising agents because it helped get loads of people. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It helped to recruit people. It helped to convey news and media and all those kinds of stories from like the war. And because that was being used and it was working so much, then it did increase the kind of like value of it.
And we're talking here like the World War propaganda, which was like, the famous picture, like your country needs you, and it's like pointing at the person. I think we talked about it in Age of Propaganda too, where where they were basically making false war atrocities done by the enemy to stiffen the resolve. I guess that's kind of the words they use, but like to basically make people more, I guess, angry, more for the war. You know, willing to sort of, well, not die for their country, but willing to stick up for themselves, and they demonize the enemy, which wasn't necessarily true. We still haven't read it, but there's that book, which I don't know if it was recommended from this book, which it might have been, was like a whole dissection of all the propaganda from World War One. And
I'd love to read it at some point.
So yeah, that's kind of how, you know, the status got improved, because people could see the actual results from using this. I guess mass
it legitimized. Absolutely. Like, and what's interesting is that the difference. So during the war, it kind of legitimized like propagandists, and then after the war, when it wasn't being used, it was then seen in like like a retrospective perspective, that it was kind of evil.
Well, because it was lying, right? Like, that's the point.
Exactly.
I guess people don't like to be deceived, and the moment they realise, you know, things were projected to them which weren't necessarily true, which were like half truths, let's just say, they start feeling a bit resentful that, oh my god, I've been had. It's, you know, you could do it like an individual example where, you know, you agree to meet somebody, a friend of yours, they tell you they can't make it because their mum died, something like that, and then you find out they were out partying or something with their friends or other friends. How would you feel? It's similar to that. It's just basically you're told something which isn't necessarily true, you believe it, and you find out it's not true later, and you're like, why? Like, why do I feel like an idiot? You just, you know, and then you build up a level of resentment, I guess.
So it is interesting from like, we judge things or tools based on the context with which we are in now, you know, from the past. So like before the war, it wasn't really heard, or it wasn't really used that much. Then during the war, it kind of legitimized propaganda. And then after the war, once everything had settled down, everyone was judging the techniques with which people used to disseminate information about the war. And then, so it started to take on this even like more negative association. Which I thought was quite interesting.
But then we can jump. I was going to say, I thought it was interesting that, you know, like you said, post it, I guess people saw obviously the effectiveness of these propaganda efforts, and therefore people started thinking, oh, maybe we can use this to sell our product. And that's kind of where this sort of PR propaganda, like advertising industry started to grow even more.
Because like, think about it. If you're working for a company, yes, you may not agree with the means with which was used during the war, but actually, if it's effective, it's effective. You can't kid yourself out of something being like working, you know? And that's the kind of paradox here, that people don't like it, but they know it works. So, you know, and like you said, it kind of started this whole PR movement.
You've got some interesting notes here as well. That Bernays believed that to influence the masses, you had to influence the influencers. Then he also believed that if the message was inaccurate, toxic, the message should be corrected. So that's probably what we're talking about before with the smoking. He wrote, for those who understood the value of the craft and could afford to make it work for them. Cool. Sweet. Well, we'll move into chapter 1 then.
Let's do it.
So chapter 1 was Organising Chaos.
Yes. So he talks a lot about like an invisible government. So he touches a lot on democracy throughout this book, but the idea that, you know, we have voted for certain candidates to represent us in politics that can make decisions on our behalf. But obviously they need to, disseminate certain information. And it's interesting
to convince you to vote for them. To keep
exactly.
Power, right? So.
Exactly. No, precisely. And he was saying that, you know, an invisible government in its sense is basically like consciously and intelligently manipulating the organized habits and opinions of the masses. And like, I found that quite interesting because obviously we're going to go into habits soon, but, you know, just how habits can be very like automated and you don't even realize you're doing it. You know, there can be such subtle behaviors. And so you're not even aware that people are consciously like manipulating you, which is just,
Well, I think maybe like an example of this would be the fact that the like governmental campaign for like reducing sugar and obviously getting more active. I can remember back in the day there was a proper campaign, wasn't there, for like keeping fit? I don't know what. Do you remember it? I swear they were like suggesting to like keep active and stuff. And I don't know if they were offering discounts or whatever. But what I mean is, this is an example of them trying to influence the habits. It's like eat less sugar, you know, work out more.
Yeah,
that was constantly being promoted, like the 5 a day. Like I'm sure scientifically that's probably not even that accurate, depending upon like your body like size, etc. Right? But these are all examples of governmental information campaigns to try and influence people, because obviously they run the NHS. Yeah. Right. And they start seeing, oh my God, we can't handle this demand for people having all these illnesses related to diabetes, you know, being overweight. So therefore, they are choosing then to do a propaganda campaign to influence the habits, to try and reduce the amount of people going in with these, you know, diseases related to being unhealthy. I mean, I guess that's a good use of propaganda, right? If we're talking about
of course.
how propaganda can be used in a good way, that's one of the ways. It's like we can see, because we have the data, that there's a lot of people who are coming in with diseases related to being overweight, diabetes. What causes these things? You know, overeating, eating lots of sugar. How can we influence the habits? You know, I mean, obviously there's more direct ways. There's ways such as like the sugar tax, which is like make it more costly to buy something with sugar. Fair enough. That's like a more of like a carrot and stick approach. Whereas this other stuff is trying to convince people, I guess, that, you know, eating a healthy lifestyle is a good thing. And once you convince them, they convince themselves, right? It's a lot easier to
precisely. I think it's weird because like if they're able to influence your ideas, which then influence your beliefs, and like we were talking last week with age propaganda in terms of like cognitive dissonance. Well, if your beliefs are slowly changing because either the experts that you look to are changing what they're saying, and then your behavior starts to change in line with those new beliefs or ideas. And so it's like, you know, you're not specifically told to think this, but you're hearing it from like these experts or whatnot. Your ideas are changing, your beliefs are changing, and then your kind of actions start to change with it. Which I think is really interesting. It's like the only issue with that whole thing is that, like, how many times have there been where like experts will recommend things and then it's not actually legit? Like it turns out that, you know, fats used to be really bad for us and now some fats are really good, you know.
So on that, I guess what they're trying to do is they're trying to break down complexity to stuff that people can just act on and do. So like they tried to break down the complexity of a variety of foods into, you know, like a pyramid. And then they tried to offer guidance upon probably what they knew at the time as the best, you know, the best advice at the time would have been that, right? But this is kind of where I see some good in all of this, which is, you know, the Bernays were saying, you know, when the information changes, you need to disseminate the new information to like update people, you know? I mean, I'm not saying this has been done very well with mass media in terms of with dietary stuff. I mean, it's still very much the, you know, the food pyramid. And like you're saying about this, the fat stuff, you're right. There's like saturated, unsaturated fat. Like, can't remember for the life of me which one's better, but I know there's a difference. And the point being now, it's become more common knowledge that one is better, or sorry, one's like better for you than the other. And that is now being disseminated through mass media. So it's being updated, if that makes sense. The propaganda has the messaging has changed because the situation has changed. We now know there is a differentiating factor between the two. And I guess with science, because it's so complicated and the research is usually like, it's never really black or white, like this is this. It's like, this can cause these effects, but at a probability of like 60%, let's just say like 60% of people have this effect, but there's also side effects, but we can get onto that another time. So they have to try and reduce that complex information to something that's actually like doable. So I guess you could even argue that sort of, you know, the 5 fruit of veg a day is taking a complex reality of like, you should probably eat a balanced diet and eat vegetables regularly to like a specific thing, which is 5 a day. Because you can't, I guess it's just saying eat more vegetables is such a loose, lofty goal. It's so hard.
It needs to be like a bit more
right?
actionable.
Like, so that's why I think they do stuff like 5 a day. You know, I don't even know, like they might even give like a 10K challenge, walk 10K, because it's just you know,
that's the new one, isn't it? 10,000 steps.
It's just a useful metric to like on average, you know, be more healthy, you know. It's because it's, you know, everybody needs different amounts because everybody's different, right? It's the classic. You can't just go like, oh, everybody walks 10K and everybody's gonna be like super fit. It's not really like that. But as a general rule, you're not going to do worse for yourself if you do these follow these like rough guidelines, right?
And I think that is a good point. Like, there is individual difference on every parameter of society or in any kind of field. But on average, people don't know about everything. So they do have to be informed. And that's kind of like the third requirement for like the kind of invisible government, because they think that it would be impossible for an individual to educate themselves on every matter. So that they need to make decisions on. Yeah, because we don't. Like, at the end of the day, we wouldn't be able to. It's
too much information. This is the reason the chapter's called Organising Chaos.
Yeah,
there's just too much to know. There's too much chaos. So they have to organise it and make it digestible by the general population, right?
Yeah.
And that is kind of the role, I guess. This is kind of his role that he claims the government has, is like digesting or using experts to figure out or delve into the chaos and extract useful information that can be disseminated to the public.
Yeah.
I guess the problem with this is, like, obviously we just talked about the good. There's also the bad, where somebody who's profit orientated can come in and, create a set of recommendations under the guise of science using experiments and disseminate information to the public, which isn't as black and white as you see. Like, I talked to you earlier about this sort of alcohol stuff, but also the vitamin stuff, like vitamin C. Like, there was a study done which proved vitamin C helped the immune system, but it wasn't like clear cut. It was never like, the science apparently was never like, oh, it definitely helps. It's like, for some people it does, but it got taken by mass media and spun to the point where like vitamin C is now seen as this like massive, it's going to save you basically, and and that has built up a whole industry now where people sell vitamin C with questionable like validity. Like, it does help some people, right? But it's still not clear cut like everything. But this is an example where like profit orientation can come in, and then we all come to believe something which isn't necessarily true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think wherever there is room for chaos of ideas that need to be basically simplified and made easy and palatable and digestible, there will always be room for people trying to capture our minds in the interest of some policy or commodity. Because think about, like, if the government have to make a decision on something, they've got loads of scientists, and some scientists are pushing forward this and some scientists are pushing forward that. Well, which one do they choose? So there is a means which they're trying to influence them, they're trying to influence them, and a decision has to be made.
Right?
Yeah. So if like you can see that there's ambiguity in society around something like whether we should have vitamin C, well, if you can convince them that you can, then your commodities, your product's going to be bought. So there's always going to be that, like, drive to capture our minds in that sense. And the thing is, like, with government especially, is like we've agreed to trust and let this kind of invisible government sift through the data.
I see.
On behalf of, like, on behalf of
the citizens.
Yes, but the issue is, like, there's always, like, we're humans at the end of the day. There is always room for human error, and there's always room for, like, human bias. Like, the people who are making the decisions, who are choosing from multiple options which one to disseminate into the public, well, there may be some error there, or it may be biased, or
and it's not necessarily always malintent, right? Like, there's that.
No, it's not
saying such as like, never. Always try and give the benefit of the doubt first. Don't really blame it to malintent. Like, they're trying to cause, irreparable damage. Like, it's funny, back to that, like, evil book. A lot of the people who do evil are the ones who are, like, convinced that they're so right. So, like, they think they're doing good, but they're doing bad. And that's kind of how I see this stuff. It's like, these people truly believe the stuff they're, like, trying to disseminate. Like, people will, like, believe in, like, let's just say the person who found the vitamin C stuff, he really truly believes it to his absolute core. So he's pushing it, like, with the conviction of somebody who just can't be wrong, and that's obviously very persuasive as well. But, like, they don't know the harm they're doing by the excessive conviction in something.
Exactly. They don't know everything. They only know what they know, right? And so it would make sense that they may truly believe in it.
And then also removing the malintent, also the incentives, right? Is the classic. Like, if they have incentives, like, their whole career is built upon this particular substance, they are obviously have massive incentive to make sure this substance is, like, heralded as a cure or whatever, because they have a lot of their, I guess, life, I was gonna say ego, like, a lot of their ego, I guess, is wrapped up in this thing that they've discovered. So they obviously have incentives to just promote it at all times, because it's almost like a personal attack if you get, like, it's not as good as you're saying it is. It's like, I spent my whole life, like, researching this, and you're telling me I've wasted it all. Like it's
you're going to double down.
Yeah. Like of course you would. Like it's only normal. It's only natural.
Yeah. No, exactly. And the thing is that like the options with which we've decided to go for this invisible government, or this is something that I got from the book, was that either you go for like free ignorance or enforced wisdom. So we could have, some like elders that are like telling us how to eat and sleep and what to wear and all this kind of stuff, that are these like kind of elitist, and that they dictate everything. Or we put our trust in some kind of invisible government that, gives us like a free market, but also, aids us in like what we should. Do you get what I mean? So it was kind of like an interesting take that I got, that, we could give everything over, like all of our free choice over. But then...
I still believe there's also the classic like mix, right? It's like there should be like relatively enforced standards, but then there should also be the ability to bite back and to fight back and to debate whether this thing that they're telling us to do is actually a good idea. Do you get what I mean? Like, I think there should be like an enforced standard, because otherwise it's just too much is going on. I think there needs to be an enforced standard, but there needs to be, this is the whole point of having freedom of speech, the ability to argue back. Because I do think if there's a free-for-all, the most persuasive people end up having like mini cults, and I think what you'd end up with is like a load of mini cults everywhere. Genuinely, I would see that as how society would organize itself, like around. I guess before you had like a centralized state, you had all these mini like factions. What were they called? What were they called before? Feudalism. The like you had like mini somebody like a mini royalty,
a lord.
That's what you end up with without a centralized authority, I think, at least. But I think there has to be a level of like you try and enforce wisdom, but there's always the ability to like debate it. But like I think that is what democracy kind of is meant to aspire to be. Like the whole point of having local councils in my head is to aspire to have that, where it's like the government comes and goes, we want to do this across the whole country, and then the local council is like, that doesn't make sense for us because we are different.
Precisely.
That's the whole point, I think, of having these like separate areas. I can't remember I think Nassim Taleb talks about it as well, as like this idea of like localization. So like you have, it's a bit like where the states works well, because you have obviously that central like federal authority, but you have different states who are run like separately. So they can all like agree on different laws, etc., which is quite cool, because the point is you can have diversity, but also you can have people who fight back against like a central authority, because that's what you don't really want, the central authority, because that's the way you end up with like despotism and authoritarianism, where nobody can question the things that somebody says, like this is the wisdom, and you're like, hang on a second, that doesn't quite add up. Like,
and that's the thing, like realistically, okay, if the centralized government is putting forward like a rule, okay, it's a blanket rule. Now, it may work on average for most districts, but then the odd district might be like, well, actually, your constituency might be like, that doesn't work here. And that's where it should be fine, right? Because it's like, okay, well, it doesn't apply to this problem or this environment, but it does apply to the whole 70%. And that's the case with most of these rules and like information that is put out there. It probably works for the average person, but that doesn't mean it works for every person.
Yeah, and like I think Rory Sutton always talks about this, like the average doesn't exist. Like the average, like he was saying something about like if you took the average person's body height in a car or something, it's actually really dangerous because there's so much variability in people. Like you can't just do it for the average, because the average doesn't make sense when there is so much variety within the average. It's just
the way that I think of it is like if you had two people and they did an exam and one got 49 and one got 51, and then you took the average of both, it's technically 50, but neither of them actually got 50.
But also
you might want.
Yes, but also with that, they are very close.
They are. Yeah, of course.
The way I think of it is like you put 10 people in a room, one of them's Bill Gates. All of a sudden, the average net worth is 20 million. When the reality is the majority are like, the net worth's like, let's just say 20,000. And there's just one with a massive outlier, which distorts the whole point, like the whole sample size. That's why averages aren't necessarily useful in like organization of chaos, and making it like doing these averages doesn't really fit everybody.
No, exactly.
But that's it was really I can see like having this conversation now and obviously trying to understand the goals of organizing uncertainty and creating like, I don't know, a society, like there is a need to have like some level of enforced understanding. I mean, like schooling in a way helps because it allows us to understand things at a similar level, or like we all kind of understand roughly the way things work. And that allows us to communicate. Because if we had a completely different idea of how things work, I mean, just look at religion, like completely different ideas of how the way, like the nature of reality. That's where you come into massive conflict because you can't find a way to even, you know, bring these two things together.
That's the thing. Is like it becomes like a doctrine, right? Like multiple ideas, they're really good for society because they help breed better ideas, right? But when they're too different that you can't even find any like commonalities between,
which is that's why in my head I think there's a necessary for some level of enforced wisdom where it's like at least we can agree on this, therefore we can, you know, we can see some similarity. Whereas if we agree on nothing, then there's, you know, then there's an issue.
No, exactly.
And then there's a trust issue.
Yes, precisely. So the only other point I got on this actually was that, and it's self-explanatory, but like as society has grown, so have the methods of mass persuasion. And he kind of used an example of like the Constitution in America, and like when that was written, right, you had small towns and small villages, so the means of communication weren't as big. And weren't as complex, but as society has grown, the means of like, you know, persuading the masses has evolved as well and become more complex. I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of like organizing the chaos.
So I would also say it's on that note, it's being kind of reversed recently. So let's just say when the printing press first came out, it was very easy to control what everybody believed. I think now it's actually harder because of the fact that you have social media and everybody can say their own opinion. So I think the reason we're seeing so much conflict at the moment is because we have so many people with different opinions who are all very convincing. Putting a stake in the ground and saying this is truth. So now the reason why everything's so fucking complicated is because there's so many different poles of apparent truth everywhere. You look around, like this guy thinks he knows the truth. This guy thinks he knows the truth. Whereas beforehand, I guess, without the ability to project your own voice, because the media would have controlled who is allowed to say what ideas. Everybody would have been on a rough agreement on most things. You know, it's just like if you speak to the older generation, they're always like, "Oh, you have to watch the news. Like, how can you know anything if you don't watch the news?" Whereas the new generation has started to realize with these other perspectives that the news isn't everything. So we start questioning the validity of the news. And now you have a point where I think because of social media and everybody can just project their own, you know, opinions on things, you have such a like fragmented perception of reality. Like I think that actually that is the reason why there's so much apparent tension and conflict at the moment, is because nobody can agree on anything, because there's just the chaos has been almost like started to come through the cracks. So beforehand, the government could easily control what everybody thought, or not just the government, but the mass media could easily control, because there was no other way to disseminate ideas to the mass. But now there's individual ways through Instagram, through Facebook. And if you build up a following, you can convince people of anything roughly, like, because you're an influencer. And that's what's happening. They're all portraying these different ideas. And then you end up with people being like, "Oh, you're an idiot because you believe this person." And then they're like, "No, you're an idiot because you believe this person." And it's like, none of them have like a monopoly on what's actually true. It's just they have their own opinions on things, right? And it's just
that I think is key, because I wonder whether it's I think people have their own echo chambers now, and I think because of that, their opinion trumps fact, and it's got to a point where like it doesn't matter what news you listen to because I believe this. Do you know what I mean? So it's like it's opinions trump, which means that if everyone has so many different opinions, which is all kind of, you know, as we've talked about in social warming and, you know, with social media and everything like that, it's all so specific down to you. And you've got your little bubble with people that,
same with the echo chamber, the algorithm is literally feeding you stuff related to the stuff you're already seeing. So if an influencer's, you know, portraying a certain ideology or an idea, you are then more likely to see other people who portray stuff similar. Bit like the whole idea that if you're a conspiracy theorist and you start watching stuff like that, you're going to see more conspiracy theories, because that's what's going to be promoted to you, because you've now been like characterized on Facebook, for example. They'll be like, this person is like this, therefore they will like this content. And that's what the algorithms do. They're literally feeding you what you want to see. So there's no like,
so it's
perspective. It
is really interesting, because I wonder if what people end up agreeing on. So yeah, everyone has so many differences now because all their like tiny unique features have all been like, enhanced in that sense. But I wonder if what people agree on is when there's like social pressure to agree on something. Okay. Because if you're in like a small group, right, and there's thousands of small groups, but you still think you're a small group, then if there's social pressure to believe in something, then you'll be more inclined. I'm talking more about like social movements at the moment that we've had over the last like 2 years, and that there is, first of all, you get a lot of virtue signaling, but you also get a lot of social pressure to believe in certain things. And I wonder if that dictates a lot. The same thing you could argue with like COVID, because yes, there's a lot of like diversification, but there's also a lot of commonality. Like think about, there's basically 2 bands of people during the whole COVID. People who didn't want to get jabbed and people who did want to get jabbed. Okay. Now that is a big consensus. It's not like there were like 50 different groups, if you get what I mean. Like we're probably bracketing them under 2. So it's weird that like you can have extreme diversification on so many different levels, but it's almost like in some levels, like BBC would have a huge following. Do you get what I mean? Okay. Yeah. It's interesting that there's 2 kind of like dichotomous levels there.
So what you mean is there's like smaller groups of like belief, and there's obviously like larger groups. Is that kind of what I'm like? Well, that's kind of what I'm hearing there. It's like there's, like you're saying with the jab or not jab, that's like a big easy categorization, and then there's other ones which are smaller and more nuanced. Is that what? Yeah.
And but the thing is that the thing that brings them all together tends to be the social pressure.
Okay. Yes.
Do you see what I mean? As in, like, if you don't get jabbed, you're killing people.
Yeah, the social pressure.
If you don't support Black Lives Matter, you don't like black people. If you don't support LGBTQ, you don't like gay people. Do you see my point? As in, like, it's loads of these people, they all like are so diverse, but actually they end up being grouped in this one thing that is interesting to be stemmed by social pressure.
An example could be you could be for all these movements, but you don't agree with the way they're being carried out.
Yeah, 100%.
And there's probably plenty of people in that bracket who are all for equality and all for these things, but they don't agree with the the character assassinations that's going on, etc. Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Or the means that it's been taken out.
Yeah, there is this like characterization between the 2. Like it's just like you're in or you're out. And you can see it, rising. I mean, don't know if you saw the Biden speech the other day. Have you seen it on Twitter?
No, I didn't.
Where he basically said like, to be honest, and this is quite bad for me because it's something I haven't even watched, and I'm taking the snippets. There's a picture of him like going like this or something with red in the background. So he looks like a bloody like
Nazi.
Literally. And he basically was demonizing the MAGA Republicans, which is fair enough. Basically saying they're a threat to democracy. But it was very much like it was a proper. This is that we're demonizing the people now. Like these are a threat. Like literally saying these people are a threat. Like that's a bold line to take from a president in my head. And it's just literally on this topic of like this, like how you can split people into 2 and cause rivalry. But anyway, we should move on because otherwise we're only on chapter 2 again.
Yes, so the chapter 2, the new propaganda. So
that's kind of what we've been talking about here. So the Industrial Revolution took away power from the kings and gave it to the people. The minority then discovered a way to influence the majorities. The promise of the democratic doctrine was that universal literacy would educate the common man so they can control the environment. But propaganda is essentially the mechanism which is used to disseminate ideals, beliefs, and doctrines on a large scale. So it's consistent. Okay, this is kind of what we talked about before, where what we were saying, where it's like there's the modern day, and obviously modern technologies has allowed propaganda to become more of an art, I guess. So beforehand, it was impossible to disseminate, I guess, apart from like a king's decree where they go out and hand, this is what the king said, or force through force.
I mean, think about like the like the preachers. Why can't I remember what the fucking word for them is?
Preachers, no?
Do
you mean like stand out on the street and they're like...
No. I mean like people who work... oh my God. People who work in churches. Priests, yeah, that's the one. Priests. Basically how like, they were the only one who got to like hear the word of God or the word from the Pope. And so literally everyone would go there
is a mass
for their information.
Idea, isn't it? That is like, but that's interesting, isn't it? You know, when you watch like I know it's obviously satirical humor or whatever, like The Life of Brian, but like you have these preachers standing in the street like preaching to people. That, if you think about that, is how mass persuasion must have happened back in the day. Like just standing up in front of people being like, this is the truth, like I have the truth. Like
it's insane. And I remember reading a book about, it was memory, and they were saying that before the printing press, when books would have been handwritten, because they were so rare to come across, that when you did, you'd literally like try and remember this stuff. Like you would actively try and remember the stuff because you would never come across it again. Which is weird. Like, you know, so yeah, like we were just saying before, as society has grown, and so as it has evolved, you know, with the industrial era, so has the means of like, you know, mass persuasion, because you can't, you know, you don't just go to a priest anymore for your, I guess some people do, but it starts off obviously with, you know, oratory, like somebody standing in front of a group of people presenting information. I guess once you then learn how to write, you could, I guess, disseminate enough information through written text, but I guess then people had to be literate. And I then think the incentive to become or to promote literacy across, you know, your realm or your country must have come from this idea that you now have mass printing. So to disseminate information, you incentivized everybody to learn, to read, etc. Obviously, then that evolved into stuff like radio waves. So you can then start disseminating through that. Obviously, then TV. And then it's funny, it's come all the way back full circle to, you know, beforehand we had the people like standing on the street, like, you know, shouting or stuff. You kind of have it now where, look what we're doing, we're like videotaping ourselves. Preaching to a degree. Like, I guess it's different because we're having a conversation, but it's still the same thing. It's like somebody standing there explaining things. But now obviously with technology, you have a way to like record it, store it, send it like unlimited amounts. You know? There is no cap. Whereas beforehand, obviously, the cap was how loud you could shout. Literally, like you were saying, like Sermon on the Mount. Oh, it's just so funny.
Like Brian when he's at the back and he can't hear. What's he saying?
Dairy farmers, not just any dairy farmers. We're talking cheese farmers. Oh God.
It's just interesting how it evolved. But at the end of the day, it does really boil down to the same sort of like underlying premise, which is, you know, it just disseminating ideas through like a medium, whether it's you know, written, spoken, visual. I think maybe off the back of this as well, we should explore the book Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I'd be down with that. It's
related obviously to propaganda because it talks about how the different styles. So like I think we've already explored this idea before. So like when you just hear voice, you take more information from the arguments because that's the only sense you get, because you have to listen to their arguments, right? That's
I think I remember you mentioning this.
And then if it's like video, you take in more information such as how people look, so it changes what's valued depending on the medium. So like if it's a picture based stuff, it's usually like what looks best. But if it's like an audio based stuff, it's kind of more like is there rhythm to it, the tone. Like there's different things that people judge. And then it's just
it's very interesting. Yeah, no, I'd be keen for that. Absolutely. I got a quote here that I wanted to read because I thought it was quite a good one. So truth is mighty and must prevail, and if any body of man believe that they have discovered a valuable truth, it is not merely their privilege but their duty to disseminate that truth. If they realize, as they quickly must, that this spreading of the truth can be done upon a large scale and effectively only by organized effort, they will make use of the press and the platform as the best means to give it wide circulation. Propaganda becomes vicious and reprehensive only when its author consciously and deliberately disseminate what they know to be lies, or when they aim at effects which they know to be prejudicial to the common good. And that was kind of what we were talking about earlier on with like his attitude to like disseminating false, like to disseminate lies, which I thought was really interesting actually.
I also find it really interesting that there's that quote where it's like a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets spoken or something as well. Because I find it interesting that, funny enough, when things aren't true and they're like exaggerated, the novelty of the thing that's being said, or the sheer like what's the word? was gonna say expectation breaking, you know, like the sheer shock maybe is the best way of putting it, of like a lie that somebody can make up. You'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe that's happened.
Yeah.
You're more likely to share lies than you are to share the truth. Like, and I find that quite interesting.
It's because it's more like outrageous, right? It's more dramatized and interesting than the truth.
Yeah.
Like,
100%.
Which is a sad concept, but it's true.
Which is also why it's, you know, it's probably easier to get media attention on lies than it is truth.
No, absolutely. And then I think the last point actually I got on this was how modern propaganda works. So they not only appeal to the individual by means of every approach, visual, graphic, and auditory, to support the national endeavor, but they also secure the cooperation of the key men in every group, persons whose mere word carried authority to hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers. So it's exactly what you were saying earlier on in terms of like influence to influencers. Because you can't feasibly influence 50,000 people on an individual scale. It would just be too expensive and it would just take so much time. So if you can influence someone who's got influence over the whole group, then
No, it's interesting because I don't think you might actually have this on the notes. We might talk about it later. But he talked about how he would sell bacon. Can you remember this?
Yes,
And he was like, so who influences the eating habits of the masses? He was like, it's the physician. So I guess that's like the doctor back in the day, right? Because the doctors must have done nutrition as well. And he's like, if you can convince, you know, doctors or people with supposed nutritional authority on like, or knowledge on what you should be eating to promote bacon, then people are going to eat it. So that's just an interesting way that he was thinking. He wasn't even thinking like, he was thinking obviously, how can we sell more of this product, or how can we sell this idea? But he was thinking, who is going to be willing to listen to this idea? Like, who is the authority that would be able to like influence the people on this idea? And therefore, for example, something with nutritional basis, it's somebody who is a nutritionist, which is why I find it so funny that if you think about a lot of marketing these days, especially like toothpaste, it's like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this.
I know.
How many dentists do you ask? And also, are they on your payroll? Probably.
Yeah.
And I also find it really funny as well that they, especially with a lot of products that are like, you know, chemical based, they're always marketed with somebody wearing a science jacket, like a lab coat. And it's just like, it's just, well, it's not criminal, but it's definitely borderline. You know, like
we fall for it so easily, though, don't we?
Well, it's organising chaos, isn't it? Like, there's too much information to take in. We can't be bothered. We can't be bothered to verify. So if somebody says, 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this, and there's a guy wearing a coat, good enough for me, I'll take it.
Yeah, you know? No, exactly. And like, they break it down like in this book. We'll get onto that chapter in a bit, but it is. So the next chapter is the new propagandists. Do you want to take us away?
Politicians are also influenced by dictators in other fields. Do you better put dictators, right?
Yes, I think basically the idea that, you know, even if there is an influencer, they're still influeed by other influencers. You know?
Okay, yes.
So it's kind of like, and I think he tried to make this out that it's kind of like a network or like a web where everyone is kind of influenced by other influences.
Everybody influences everybody, right? This is
exactly
kind of the point which we were making earlier, which is, you know, propaganda is like impossible to avoid, because the moment you try to convince somebody of anything, you're always like mutually convincing each other, you know?
And it was interesting because he was saying that because the like association to propaganda, the actual word, was so negative that they rebranded it to, what is it? It's Public Relations Council, which is it's PR basically. But I just think that's really interesting because it's probably something that happens quite a lot. Like even we were talking about labels a while back, for like businessman, you know, and it's like, or salesman, and then it's like changed because
it was like bin man has gone to like waste disposal, or waste salesman is now business executive development. It's a rebrand, so to remove like you said, to remove any negative connotation, right? Like you know, it's interesting as well. It's like a bit like with the stuff I was saying about Joe Biden and the MAGA Republicans. I love it how he's created a subset of Republicans. Do you know what I mean? Instead of being like the Republicans, he's gone the MAGA Republicans. So it's kind of another way. It's a rebrand. It's like basically saying, I guess it's basically saying fanatical Trump supporters. But MAGA Republicans, it's just quite interesting. Like the bin men became waste disposal, salesmen came business executives.
Which ironically is probably propaganda, like to change the labels of things.
Well, it is.
Propaganda. The word got propaganded. I think you could officially say.
Yeah. Technically, you're right, because Public Relations Council. I find it quite interesting because a lot of these, like, it reminds me. Remember, I think it was on the last podcast when I told you about the changing of business terminology. It was like, what we need to do is sell more, make it pay less, and make the bastards work harder. And then it was something like increase revenue, drive down costs, and like it just makes me laugh how we've come to this point where like everything now sounds so formal and professional, and it's removed like I guess some of the more direct ways of saying things. It's
absolutely.
Which is why, remember ages ago I said to you, there's like, I really like the idea of like, if you want to understand something, instead of like, having a name for it, like Public Relations Council, describe what it does. So like, I guess you could be like, what does the UK government do in Parliament? They shout at each other across the table whilst debating key issues, and they call each other names. Like if you wrote it down, you'd be like, what a silly process. You kind of get what I mean. It's
no, I agree.
But let's hastily get on, because I'm aware that I've about 30 minutes left.
So I think there were 5. Well, he explains what a public relations counsellor does, or a propagandist. And its kind of main aim is to bring an idea into the consciousness of the public by analysing the problems of the client and making sure that what they want to offer is something the public would actually accept. Then they would consider the public's support for certain actions, doctrines, or opinions surrounding this offer. And then they would endeavor to shape the actions of the client so that they will gain the interest, approval, and acceptance of the public. They basically formulate methods of governing all the aspects of clients' behavior that come into contact with the public, which makes a lot of sense. And then his last point, which I thought was quite interesting, is like, he is not like an advertising man. He just basically says where advertising is needed. So to like sum it up, it's basically, they want an idea into the consciousness of the public, so they gauge what the problem of the company is and what they want to offer, and then they go to the public. So they do it like separately. So they figure out the company, they figure out the public, and then figure out how they can both merge in a sense, and how they can influence each other.
I feel like that last point about not being advertising, like you figure out where to advertise, you're not actually doing the advertising yet. You're figuring out the leverage points to disseminate the idea, essentially.
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. Okay, so then on to chapter 4, the psychology of public relations. And this is kind of what we were talking about before. So like they said that, there's a point here that studies have shown that the group mind has mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual and is motivated by impulses and emotions. So if we can understand those mechanisms, then can we not control it without them knowing, essentially? It was saying that in place of thoughts, there are like impulses, habits, and emotions. And like when thinking for itself, like as in the group, what happens is it usually relies on either a trusted leader, or if that leader is absent, then it relies on cliches. So if you know how those mechanisms work, then you can, like we were just talking about, you can get an expert in, or you can manufacture certain like cliches. So you're changing the stereotype.
No, I like it. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Really,
it really does. Like it's the same thing with influence on an individual level. How like influence, the actual book, right? It was all talking about the psychological mechanisms of how we're influenced. If you know how they work, you can influence people, or you can stop being influenced. The same thing goes for a group, and like we were talking about with what's it called, that the bystander effect. When everyone just looks around, it's like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to copy him, and he doesn't know what he's doing, so he copies the other person. And everyone's in the same fucking position. But if you know how that works, then you could be the leader who steps forward and goes, I'm going to do that really confidently, and then everyone looks to you. Interesting
enough. You could, if you take the initiative and be the leader, people will tend to follow. And it's always that second person, isn't it? There's that thing where it's like once the second person joins, it becomes socially acceptable.
Yeah.
So like, or if you know, or maybe even the third, right? It's like, for example, if I go out onto the street and I just lie down by myself, I'm a maniac. If you came and joined me and somebody else did, all of a sudden people probably just join just to be like, what are they doing? Like, there must be something they're looking at, you know?
Yeah.
They can't all be crazy. But
no, absolutely. It's really interesting. Like, I think you could definitely leverage mass quite easily in certain areas, especially when there are other like factors present, such as like ambiguity and stuff like that.
Yeah, especially when the action you want them to take is not very costly. So, for example, I think it'd be a lot easier to convince somebody to look in a direction if we all just stood there and looked in a certain way. You will get people to be able to do it. But I think when it comes to lying down on the floor, less people are going to join because there's like a cost to it. There's almost like turning around and looking, there's like no cost because you can immediately pretend you're doing something else, or you can be like, it's over. Whereas lying down on the floor means you're kind of like committed to this like, group think.
No, it's very true.
Group mentality.
Yeah. I have a point here that was saying that the human desires are the steam which makes the social machines work. Only by understanding them can the propagandists control that vast, loose-jointed mechanism which is modern society. And I kind of related it to, I made a link to kind of elephant in the brain, because you're understanding the underlying motives and rather than the surface level motives. And if you can understand that and you can somehow manipulate that or control that, then you're kind of winning. You're getting in there so that people desire you rather than you needing, you desiring them. Which it brings me on to my second point, which is like, it was this example. And he was saying that
example,
he's saying like, under the old salesmanship, the manufacturer said to the prospective purchaser, please buy a piano. The new salesmanship has reversed the process and caused the prospective purchaser to say to the manufacturer, please sell me a piano.
So I guess the best way of putting this is like creating the demand to the point where instead of like trying to get somebody, they want it. They actively want the product rather than you having to convince them. I thought he made a good point here as well, because he said like the way he would do it as well was to legitimize like a room in the house, to have like a piano room, wasn't it? It was like a music room or something like that. It was like legitimize the use of like having a piano in your house in like in a specific room where you're like, I don't know, entertaining guests, to make it like sexy, if that makes sense. And I thought that was really cool because like it's going back to like, make them have the idea that they want a music room. So like, you don't have to sell them on the piano. You've sold them on the idea of having a music room. And then what comes next when you got a music room? Oh, I want a piano.
Exactly.
It's quite, I like that actually a lot. It's like indirect selling, isn't it? Yeah. So like all you have to do is the advert is show somebody playing piano in their very nice music room. And they're like, I want a music room.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, well, logically now I have to buy a piano, or I have to buy a guitar, or I have to buy something that would, fit the bill for that specific thing.
Exactly. It makes so much sense. And like, I think he was also talking about how he would disseminate it into, the higher classes and how all of them would have one. And then a music room became the big thing. And then you would entertain guests in the music room. So then if someone came around to your house and they're expecting there to be a guest room, or, an area where they're going to be entertained, their expectations, and like you just said, if you sell them on the idea for a music room, well, then their expectation next is to have a piano. So it is very smart to convince someone as if it's their own idea.
Of course, what's the best way of putting it? You kind of sell them the dream, the situation, rather than the specific product. But logically, what comes from the dream is that specific product. So like we said, it's you sell them on having like an entertainment room where you bring guests in, you showcase your piano, or you showcase your musical like room or whatever, and there you automatically then sell yourself on having to have a room, which would then mean you have to have the piano for it. And I like what you said about this like idea of the higher class, because I think you've got a bit here, the quote above, which is like human desires and the steam which makes the social engine work, or social machine. And a lot of it is like based upon the aspiring middle class and giving, you would even say that the highest class of the richest people don't care about luxury brands, because they have so much money, it doesn't fucking matter. They don't need to prove it. Whereas what they try and do is they try and convince like the middle class that the high class all wear Rolexes, all have the best brands, because then they aspire to buy those things.
Yeah.
And it, like, I reckon if you probably looked at the sales of like luxury brands, it probably actually happens to more that aspiring class than it does the highest class, or so to speak. Or, depending how you define the highest class, right? Just because you have lots of money doesn't make you, high class. But the point being, like, the richest class, maybe the aspirational class that everybody looks to, is actually not what they think. It's been sold to them as that's what the aspirational class is.
Absolutely. And I think that is a really good point, because if we all technically have a desire to climb status,
of course,
and with that comes more resources, more money, more wealth, everything like that. Respect, and like you said, and on a surface level, you might think that all rich people own a Ferrari and have a Rolex. It's probably not the case. But that if that's sold to you, and that idea of like chasing that dream is there, then you're going to chase after those things that are associated with it.
I have to say, I find it like, it's just when you see all those like people on Instagram, like, like fake business course sellers who like, you're driving their Ferrari, like sipping cocktails, like giving like motivational quotes about being a millionaire. And I'm just like, you are the problem. I think they are the problem, because they're disseminating to loads of impressionable young people like, this is the life you should aspire to have. And it's just like, oh, really? That's not that's not the people who, who actually achieve massive things don't live like that. They're too busy fucking working. They're too busy actually doing shit, changing the world, not sitting there sipping an espresso martini, showing off their Rolex, being I've made it, and then trying to convince others. It's painful.
My ex, she said that Warren Buffett met her dad once.
Yes.
And he rocked up to their house and he had like salad in a bag. Just, he's like,
because they also don't spend loads of money. They don't need to show off.
But also the reason why they're rich, right, is because they do what they like first, and then money came. They didn't chase the money.
Exactly.
So the money doesn't change their behavior that much. Look at like Bill Gates and, Jeff Bezos. Well, but Bill Gates doesn't act like the most rich person.
Yeah. I think they're slightly different as well, because they actually have so much money that, like, buying a massive mansion doesn't even bother them. Of course, they're going to have one. But no, I get the whole point. It's like, they don't need to wear designer clothing, because it's like the reverse signaling effect. Is like, I don't need to show you that I made it, because I've made it. So I can just be like, if anything, it's cooler for me to wear nothing, because then you're like, oh my god, I can't believe he's so like humble. I guess I don't know. It's an interesting point about how using class, or ideals of classes. So like the whole point like he has is like creating like an ideal that people can aspire to be. Which in fact we might get onto this next, to be honest. I don't know if it's coming.
Well, this kind of jumps on to our next point, which is the next chapter, which is business and the public, and how business used to run on its own affairs without considering the public's opinion, and demand created supply. But today the supply must actively seek to create its own corresponding demand, which is exactly what we were just saying, as in like, you want to make them think that they need a piano rather than you're trying to sell them the piano. And that's kind of like the modern take on propaganda today. Yeah,
I guess it's similar to what we were just saying then. It's like they want to be like a person, or they want to be like an ideal they have in their head.
Yeah.
And then you position your product without direct claim. So you don't be like, this product will get you there. What you do is you sell them the image of the person with the product, and by association, you assume that either the product helped them, or to be that person, you have to have that product. A bit like what we're saying about designer clothes and Rolexes or whatever. What you do is you create an ideal that they have to aspire to be, and then that aspirational model has the Rolex. It has the Ferrari. So then they're like, that's what, to be successful, I have to be that. Therefore, I have to have these things.
Yeah.
That's how it kind of works. It's like, to be there, I have to have this.
Yeah. And it's and to create that, that's his next point, is like the public relations counselor or the propagandist needs to be like familiar with the structures, the prejudices, and like the whims of the general public. So their attitudes towards that, right? Towards a music room, towards, this rich person, so that they can start to manifest something that is in their liking. And so that also requires them to like be in touch with the public, because the public is becoming increasingly kind of discriminative in its standards. Like, just take an example today would be like more eco-friendly, more inclusivity, diversity, all these kinds of things of like a certain company, right? If they're selling a product, they're holding them to certain standards. And so, you know, you turn away from someone that's from a company that's doing fast fashion or those kinds of things. So the propagandist has to be kind of in touch with those things. Otherwise, you're not really going to get past the first barrier, which I thought was quite interesting, actually.
I get the point of trying to like fit the idea to the audience. I get that the point is like you have to kind of know what they're thinking already to give them something that they're actually going to like believe. Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess if you gave somebody their aspiring model of like this, like, you know, businessman, but the people you're shifting this message to is people who are like really hardworking in like, I don't know, or like really not well off at all. They're just aspiring to get by. You know, that message is just going to fall flat. It's like picking an audience, finding the prejudices, the things they already believe, and then presenting a message to them, which is almost why this stuff we talked about with the algorithms and the echo chambers is more interesting, because it's like you get fed specific information and then the algorithm recommends stuff which is going to just keep feeding that specific bias or belief you have. So you're going to start seeing everything through this worldview because all you ever see is this worldview.
Yeah. And I think that's why kind of they need to be able to interpret the public really accurately. And because if they're representing a company and there are all these different angles of perspective from the public and you can interpret them all accurately, then you know what the key is to that lock, if you get what I mean. You know, like how to approach that particular perspective of the company, which is kind of like what he kind of describes as like the two jobs for like a propagandist, which is like to continuously interpret, which is kind of like a reaction. It's like, how do you perceive this company? And then the second job is like to dramatize by like he calls it high spotting, which is like kind of a reaction, right? So that is the key to the lock in that sense. So how to react accordingly to convince them. And that's the kind of thing, because if your interpretation of how your public views you is off, then it's not very good. And coming back to your example with like YouTube, if their algorithm is slightly off and they keep showing you certain videos that have got nothing to do with what you like, then you're probably not going to go back, right?
100%.
Yeah, so it kind of needs to be calibrated and quite accurate.
Yeah, the messaging has to be calibrated. Like, you can't have a one message fits all kind of thing, isn't it?
No, exactly.
It's almost why you got such a massive divide with like CNN and what's the other one, Fox, like because their viewers have to, you know, they believe a certain thing, so the information has to be presented to them in a way which they're going to agree with. Because if they didn't, they would, you know, reject it. Essentially, they wouldn't watch anymore. Yeah, they wouldn't listen. It's crazy.
It's interesting how we've got to a place like with technology where the equations are kind of personalized now, as in you get personalized content. Whereas like normally a company would grow bigger and bigger and bigger and they'd get more and more customers. So there's more and more perspectives that they have to take into consideration to interpret and then respond. But actually now it's weird because you kind of create your own response. Like a customer creates their own response with technology, right? I go on YouTube, I watch 5 videos, that creates the equation which responds with more.
Like it's working out very on an individualistic level. It's like working you out and presenting to you stuff that will be, you know, based upon what it's, you know, figured you out to be like. Like it's figured out what you aspire to be. What I find quite interesting, what I've noticed at least, I don't know about you, but my interests obviously change, wane. You know, I'm interested in some things a couple of months, I'm not interested in the other months. And I find it really fascinating how quick YouTube adapts to my current interests. So like back when I was watching CoffeeZilla a lot, all I would see on my YouTube, I mean, he's still there. He's just there less. And it depends what I'm searching. Like I've been watching the Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett recently. And ever since I started watching his stuff, I'm, you know, constantly getting regurgitated more of his stuff. But and then my homepage just changes completely. But I just find it interesting because like it does actually change depending on what but it's just the speed of the change, that gets me. It's like the fact that just 2 days of watching certain videos, and all of a sudden my whole new information palette is just different.
But that's it's probably like a pattern, isn't it? Yeah, because if you have a pattern and you break the pattern, that in itself is a pattern, right? If you're watching loads of CoffeeZilla and then you just watch one video of Stephen Bartlett, then okay, they might be like, oh, maybe that's an anomaly. But then if you watch like two, three, then they might change and be like, okay, maybe this is their change in interest.
Yeah.
Which is
interestingly, as well, I've been, looking more into like football because the football season started, and then I'm starting to get like new videos related to, like, for example, because I support Chelsea, the stuff will come up for Chelsea. I'm a bit like, wow, this is really figuring me out quicker than I like. But I guess it's how they keep you on the whole platform. The whole point is they're meant to show you stuff you want to see. But I can imagine the thing I've realized as well is my personality is very like sporadic. Like I'm very like I need information. Like I'm very sensitive, to information. Like I'm bored very easily, so I need to like new things all the time. But I can imagine somebody who maybe isn't quite like that and who just likes stability, what I'm used to, can get themselves into a point where all they're seeing is just constant same information. Do you get what I mean? Like this is how you get like extremized. Like you become like an extreme political view because all you see is all these like things coming at you, and because you don't really care about seeing anything new, an alternative perspective, you just end up like almost getting to the point where your whole newsfeed is just he's a villain, he's a villain, he's a villain, he's a villain. And how? Well,
I wonder if it's like the difference between breadth and depth, right? Yes, you'll be shown multiple different videos. He'll be shown the same video, but in more of like an intense or more depth.
No, I think it's like that. If your interests aren't changing, maybe it's because I'm young as well. Maybe my eye will change as I get older, but I'm always getting shown new things all the time. Yeah. But at the same time, there is a level of like, I bet in fact, even back when we were watching like the Peterson lectures, I would get, regurgitated stuff like Peterson. But then also, funny enough, people like Ben Shapiro would come up, who's also known to be like that sort of alt-right. And it's funny then, because that's all then I end up seeing is this alt-right stuff. Yeah, which obviously is going to influence my opinion on things, and I just find it like it's crazy because almost like the way you start off almost influences you in the end, because you start off and it just feeds you stuff that helps you build this like worldview around this perspective, so to speak.
I wish that they would create something where you could like tick a box and it would be like show you almost the opposite of that.
Yeah, literally like inverse me, like also like do the opposite. Like give me the stuff that you think I don't want to see. To be fair, I might actually see it and be like, this is just criminal. Like you don't know how you'd react, but it'd be interesting. It would be interesting. I'd love to see the stuff like, because you're blind to what you can't see. So
exactly, and it distorts your reality
100%.
Of what the world is like. So I think to build on that, like a propagandist's job is basically to anticipate the trends of public opinion. And either they have like two routes of action. They can try and convince the public that their fears or prejudices are kind of like unjustified, or the alternative is to modify the action of the client in themselves by removing whatever the cause of complaints is. So, which makes sense. It's either one or the other. You either change the public or you change the company. Which I think makes sense. And then there was this interesting point that he had in this chapter, which I hadn't come across before, is like inter-commodity competition. So between like products which he like used alternatively for the same purpose. And he had like an example of like, if you represent the plumbing and heating business, you are a mortal enemy of the textile industry because warmer homes mean lighter clothes, right? Yeah. And it was quite interesting. I never thought of that. And it kind of like
makes sense, doesn't it?
It links back to kind of what we were saying earlier on with how all the influences are influenced by other influences, right?
There's a reason why like Nike and sports-based companies promote sports and activity, because why wouldn't they? Because the more people who do sports, the more product they sell, right? Yeah. It's interesting. It is very interesting. Because it just makes sense.
There's always going to be someone who wins and loses at the end of the day. It's like a pull and tug kind of war.
Yeah.
So should we jump onto the next one?
Yeah, I think we're going to probably run out of time here again. We're absolutely these books are always getting into sort of, how many do we have left? We got education. No, we got political leadership, education, social service, art and science, and mechanics. I'm wondering if it's worth us just doing a separate one, to be honest. Only because I don't think we can get through it in 15 minutes, and I need to leave in 15.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine, mate. Absolutely.
So we're that's another really exceptionally long propaganda video.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed it. We will get into political leadership next time. What else do we have? Sorry. Education, which we touched on last time, social service, art and science, and then the mechanics of it.
Lovely.
But perfect.
Sounds good. Well, there you have it, guys. The first part of Propaganda by Edward Bernays. It's definitely a refreshing take on propaganda, so hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, make sure to leave us a like, and why not comment? We would love to know your thoughts on propaganda and if you agree with Bernays' take on it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can be notified next week when we bring out part 2. But until then, have a good one and stay wise.